So welcome to another lecture series on this channel. This time we're going to talk about post-clearance audit and prior disclosure program in relation to the Bureau of Customs. So before we proceed, I think it's best that we first have an overview of what post-clearance audit is. So when we talk about post-clearance audit, I think it's best if we first understand what the prefix post means. So when we talk about the prefix post, according to dictionary.com, it means behind, after, later, subsequent to, or posterior to. So when we talk about post-clearance audit, you are talking about something or an activity which is conducted after or subsequent to the clearance of the goods imported from the Bureau of Customs. So it's not something that is done before, it's not something that is done simultaneous with, but rather it is something done after the goods have been cleared from the Bureau of Customs. So we just mentioned that post-clearance audit is an activity which is conducted after the goods have been cleared from the Bureau of Customs. But what does it mean when we say that the goods have been cleared from the Bureau of Customs? So, Customs Administrative Order number 1-2019, specifically Section 3.2 thereof, gives us an idea or gives us the definition of what customs clearance is. So, according to that particular provision, customs clearance shall refer to the completion of customs and other government formalities necessary to allow goods to enter for consumption, warehousing, transit or transshipment, or to be exported or placed under another customs procedure. So we are going to discuss customs clearance further later on, but for purposes of having an overview, we now know what post means, we now know what customs clearance means. So at least this will help us, or this will guide us to have an idea of what post-clearance audit is. Again, to reiterate, to repeat, post-clearance audit is an audit or an activity which is conducted after the goods have been cleared from the Bureau of Customs. Another concept which we should familiarize ourselves with is the concept of assessment under the CMTA. So what does assessment mean, or what do you mean when you assess in the context of customs and tariff laws? So let's refer to section 102F of the CMTA, and this gives us a definition of assessment. So the provision, the pertinent portion of the provision reads that assessment is the process of determining the amount of duties and taxes and other charges due on imported or exported goods. Now, we all know that the general rule is when imports come into the country, they are expected, or they are supposed to pay duties and taxes on such importation. Now, the process of computing or ascertaining the exact amount of such duties and taxes and other charges which should be paid upon importation or exportation, as may be the case, that's called assessment. Okay? So that's again section 102F of the CMTA. The next question that should be answered then is, who are the parties involved in the assessment process, or in the process of determining the amount of duties, taxes, and other charges due on the importation or exportation? So section 424 of the CMTA gives us the answer. The Bureau of Customs is of course involved in the assessment process. Section 424 of the CMTA reads, for purposes of assessing duties and taxes on imported goods, the customs officer, so there you have it, the customs officer shall classify, value, and determine the duties and taxes to be paid. The customs officer shall prepare and submit an assessment report as established under this act. So among the duties of the customs officer or of the Bureau of Customs as enumerated in this provision are as follows. Number one is to classify, to value, to determine the duties and taxes to be paid, and then thereafter to prepare the assessment report. Okay, so when we say classify, The Bureau of Customs is involved in the process of determining the proper heading and or subheading using the classification rules under the CMTA, and thereafter determining the corresponding rate of duty. When we say value, the Bureau of Customs is also involved in the process of determining the dutiable value based on the valuation methods also previously discussed in the CMTA, which will form the basis of the duties and taxes to be paid also. And then from there, you have the applicable classification and rate. You also have the applicable dutiable value, and with those figures, you can determine the duties, taxes to be paid on the importation. So after you've done those three things, the Bureau of Customs or the assigned customs officer will now then prepare the assessment report on the goods. You may have also heard of the concept of self-assessment, no? So when we say self-assessment, it also means that it's not only the Bureau of Customs which is involved in the process of determining the correct amount of duties and taxes to be paid on the importation. It also means that aside from the Bureau of Customs, the importer itself or the customs broker is also directly involved in the process of assessment. As a matter of fact, it's initially the customs broker and or the importer who determines or which determines the amount of duties and taxes to be paid. Remember that when the goods declaration is filled up or filled out, there are certain boxes or blanks therein which should be filled up, and among those boxes or among those details which should be supplied are the corresponding heading of the importation, the corresponding rate of duty of the importation, the corresponding or the applicable dutiable value of the importation, and from there you have computed or you will be able to compute the duties and the taxes and the other charges to be paid on the importation. So in the process of filling up or filling out the goods declaration, you are already doing the assessment simultaneously. So that's what we mean when we say self-assessment. It just simply means that the broker and or the importer itself is directly involved and has a direct hand in the process of assessment or the computation of duties, taxes, and other charges to be paid on the importation. Now, the next question is, after the process of assessment or after the process of ascertaining the amount of duties, taxes, and other charges to be paid on the importation, can such assessment still be modified or altered? Can the assessment be changed? Can the computation be altered or modified? The general rule is in the negative. So Section 427 of the CMTA tells us the general rule regarding modification or alteration of the assessment. It tells us that such appraisal, classification, or return as finally passed upon and approved or modified by the district collector shall not be altered or modified in any manner except. Okay, so from that part of the provision of the CMTA, we are given the general rule. So again, the general rule is that the assessment may not be altered or modified. But as you can see, there are exceptions to this general rule, and we will discuss these exceptions later on. So we mentioned the general rule that the assessment is generally not to be altered or to be modified, but we also mentioned that there are exceptions. So the exceptions can also be found in Section 427 of the CMTA. The first exception is that the assessment can be altered or modified within 1 year after payment of the duties upon statement of error in conformity with Section 912 of the CMTA as approved by the district collector. So this instance or this exception refers to manifest clerical errors This requires a statement of error as directed under Section 912 of the CMTA. But then again, this exception to the general rule is not really the subject of our discussion. But suffice it to know that this is one of the exceptions to the general rule that the assessment cannot be altered or modified. Okay, so another exception to the general rule is also enumerated in section 427. Number 2, the second exception is as follows. Within 15 days after such payment, upon request for reappraisal or reclassification addressed to the commissioner by the district collector, if the appraisal or classification is deemed to be low. The third exception to the general rule is also found in the same provision. Number 3, upon request for reappraisal and or reclassification in the form of a timely protest addressed to the district collector by the interested party if the latter should be dissatisfied with the appraisal or return. So the third exception to the general rule that assessment cannot be modified or altered is a protest. Okay, the protest is the third exception to the general rule that assessment cannot be altered or modified. Finally, section 427 gives us the fourth and the last exception to the general rule that assessment cannot be altered or modified. And here's the last exception. Number 4, upon demand by the commissioner after the completion of compliance audit in accordance with the provisions of the CMTA. So fourth, compliance audit, that's the fourth and last exception to the general rule that assessment cannot be altered or modified. Among the 4 exceptions that we have enumerated thus far, this fourth exception, compliance audit, this is the one that we are interested in as far as our discussion is concerned. So suffice it to know that as far as post-compliance audit is concerned, what is the effect of a post-compliance audit? The tendency is after a post-compliance audit, there is a chance or there is a possibility that the assessment can be modified or altered. After the post-compliance audit, there is a possibility or there will be a possibility that the initial computation of duties, taxes, and other charges will be modified or will be corrected, will be increased, will be decreased, or will be changed as may be necessary or correct under the pertinent laws or rules. Okay. We have an idea now of what post-clearance audit is. We have also an idea of what assessment is, and we know the general rule that an assessment cannot be modified or altered, and that there are 4 exceptions to such general rule. We also know that a compliance audit is one of the exceptions to the general rule that an assessment cannot be altered or modified. But what is the objective or what are the objectives of a post-clearance audit? Why does the Bureau of Customs conduct post-clearance audit? So the objectives can be seen from the WCO Manual on Post-Clearance Audit, and it is outlined as follows. The overall objectives of the post-clearance audit is to assure that customs declarations have been completed in compliance with customs legal requirements as well as other requirements under any other law applicable in respect of import or export via examination of a trader's systems, accounting, and other business records or premises. Okay, so from that statement of general objective alone, we see that the primary objective of a post-clearance audit is to check or to verify or to see whether or not the goods declaration, in the case of the CMTA, the goods declaration has been properly filled out. So when we do the post-clearance audit, the primary objective is to check the correctness, accuracy, the veracity of the details supplied in such goods declaration. You check whether or not such items declared in the goods declaration are in accordance with or does not violate the pertinent customs laws, the CMTA, CAOs, or CMOs, You check if those items declared are in compliance with pertinent customs laws, rules, or regulations. Um, and how, please take note also that the statement of general objective tells us how this objective is achieved. So this statement from the WCO manual on post-clearance audit tells us that the audit or this verification or this checking of the goods declaration is done via examination of the trader system, accounting, or other business records or premises. What does that mean? It means that when the Bureau of Customs does its audit, or when the Bureau of Customs checks the correctness or the accuracy of the items stated in the goods declaration, it does so through examination of the records or the systems of the importer itself or of the broker concerned in the importation. So the Bureau of Customs does not check using its own records, but rather the Bureau of Customs checks the accuracy or the veracity of the items declared in the goods declaration through the own records or through the own systems of the importer and or the broker concerned. So let's go to the specific objectives of a post-clearance audit. So number one, post-clearance audit is conducted to verify that the value, origin, and classification of goods is declared correctly and the amount of revenue legally due has been identified and collected. So we mentioned earlier that assessment is the process of determining the proper amount of duties, taxes, and other charges to be paid and collected on the importation. So when you do the audit, in effect, you check and you verify whether such items have been correctly determined or computed. We mentioned that when you determine the value, you do so in accordance with the proper transaction value methods or the applicable the applicable valuation method rather under the CMTA. Classification, you will check, or when the audit is done, you will check if the proper heading or if the proper rate has been reflected in the goods declaration, and you also check the computation if the amount of duties as computed is also correct. So second specific objective of a post-clearance audit is to ensure goods liable to specific import or export controls are properly declared, including prohibitions and restrictions, licenses, quota, etc. So for example, of course, by this point, we have an idea or we know about regulated importations or importations which may require special licenses or permits before they can come into the country or before they may be imported into the country. So when we do a customs post-clearance audit, you also verify if such licenses or permits have been complied with or have been duly reflected or reported in the goods declaration, or you check also if such licenses or permits have been kept as required under the law by the importer or by the broker concerned. So the third specific objective of a post-clearance audit, to ensure conditions relating to specific approvals and authorizations are being observed. Example, pre-authenticated transit documents, preferential origin or movement certificates, licenses, quota arrangements, customs and excise warehouses, and other simplified procedure arrangements. So finally, the last specific objective of a post-clearance audit is to facilitate international trade movements of the compliant traders. So we will later on see that post-clearance audit encourages compliance because it also encourages brokers and importers to properly and correctly declare the goods, the items to be imported, the proper rates, the proper headings, the proper and applicable value, and proper computation of the duties and other taxes which may be due on the importation. So as we will also later on discuss, selection to be the subject of a post clearance audit is based on risk factors, and the idea being that the more compliant you are likely to be, the less likely you are to be selected as a subject of post clearance audit. So we will later on discuss more about that. So suffice it to say at this point that the last or the specific objective of a post-clearance audit is to facilitate international trade movements of the compliant traders. One point of clarification though, post-clearance audit, as we will discuss in this series, is different from internal audit. So, post-clearance audit should not be confused with the concept of an internal audit, which is a mechanism to verify and review, either conducted by a company to review its own internal procedures or by customs to review customs' own internal rules and procedures. Internal audits may be useful for management purposes and are an important part of an integrity program, but are quite distinct from the concept of post-clearance audit. So again, to reiterate or to explain it simply, internal audit is an audit conducted by an own entity in its own internal procedures and processes. So it's not like the post-clearance audit where it is the Bureau of Customs which conducts an audit on the processes of another entity, whether it be the importer or whether it be the broker, but rather, again, this emphasizes that the concept of internal audit is different from the concept of post-clearance audit. So let us not be confused about that. The internal audits are different from the concept of post-clearance audit.